My name is Madeline and I am 30 years old. He looked at me across our anniversary dinner table and said, "Stop acting like we are married. You do not get a say in where I go or who I am with." Everyone laughed. I just smiled and stayed quiet. But when he came back from his guys' weekend, his key no longer worked. And he was stunned when the neighbor told him exactly why. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a toxic partner a lesson they will never forget. I work as the vice president of hotel operations for a boutique hospitality chain in Chicago. My husband Carter is 33 and a regional sales director. We were supposed to be celebrating our 5th wedding anniversary. Instead, we were sitting in a private dining room at one of the most expensive steakhouses in the city, surrounded by his friends and his parents. The ambient lighting caught the crystal wine glasses, casting shadows over the prime cuts of meat we had barely touched. I sat in absolute silence as the humiliation washed over me. Carter raised his glass of bourbon, his eyes locking onto mine with a challenging glint. That was when he delivered the line that effectively ended our marriage. He wanted to assert his dominance in front of his audience, reducing our vows to a punchline. The table fell dead silent for a brief second before the true nature of his support system revealed itself. Carter's mother, Brenda, was the first to break the tension. She let out a loud, obnoxious laugh that echoed against the mahogany walls of the private room. "Oh, Carter, you always tell it like it is," she chimed in, wiping a tear of mirth from her eye. The rest of his friends quickly joined the chorus of chuckles, completely validating his blatant disrespect. I kept my face perfectly composed, betraying none of the cold realization settling in my chest. Looking at Brenda, I understood exactly where Carter learned his toxic behavior. My mind quickly cataloged the absurdity of the situation. I was the primary breadwinner. My salary paid the astronomical rent on the luxury townhouse we lived in. I covered the utility bills, the grocery runs, and the expensive vacations Carter loved to boast about on his social media. Yet he constantly felt the need to overcompensate with this exhausting display of aggressive masculinity to mask his deep-seated insecurities. He needed his friends and his mother to believe he was the undisputed king of his castle. He needed them to think I was just a subservient accessory who bowed to his every whim. The reality was that he lived a lavish lifestyle funded entirely by my exhausting 60-hour work weeks. He wore designer suits paid for by my bonuses, but admitting that would shatter the fragile ego he had spent 5 years carefully constructing. So instead, he chose to humiliate me on the very night we were supposed to celebrate our partnership. Basking in the glow of his mother's approval and his friends' laughter, Carter decided to push the boundary even further. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, and boldly announced to the table that he was leaving this Friday. "I am taking a much-needed guys' fishing trip to Cabo," he declared, grinning at his buddies. The sun, the ocean, and absolutely no nagging wives allowed. My heart rate spiked, not because of the trip itself, but because of a discovery I had made earlier that afternoon. I had logged into our joint banking portal to pay our property taxes and noticed a massive unexplained withdrawal from our savings account. "Carter," I said, keeping my voice soft but firm, so the entire table had to strain to listen. "Is that why you took almost everything out of our joint savings account today?" The atmosphere in the room plummeted from jovial to violently uncomfortable. Carter's confident smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a dark, furious scowl. He slammed his glass down on the table so hard the remaining liquid spilled over the rim. "You are a penny-pinching control freak," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "You always ruin a good time by obsessing over every single cent." Without another word, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his heavy metal credit card, and threw it aggressively across the table. It struck my plate with a loud clatter. The piece of plastic sat there next to my half-eaten steak, a physical manifestation of his utter disrespect. The entire dining room watched, holding their collective breath, waiting for me to break down, cry, or run out of the restaurant in shame. Instead, I calmly reached forward and picked up the card. I signaled the waiter who had been hovering nervously near the doorway. "I will take the check for the entire table," I said smoothly. When the leather folder arrived, I placed his card inside to pay the $1,500 dinner bill. I signed the receipt deliberately, never once breaking eye contact with my husband. His face was flushed with anger, clearly expecting a fight that would further validate his narrative of the crazy controlling wife. But I refused to give him the satisfaction of a public argument. I handed the folder back to the waiter, folded my napkin, and placed it neatly beside my plate. Beneath my calm exterior, a profound shift had occurred. The love and loyalty I had harbored for half a decade evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. He had demanded freedom. He had publicly declared that our marriage was a burden and that my financial oversight was an annoyance. As I looked at him surrounded by his enabling mother and sycophantic friends, I made a silent vow. If he wants absolute freedom, I thought to myself, he is about to get it in ways he cannot possibly fathom. The drive back to the townhouse was silent. Carter blasted the radio, radiating a smug satisfaction from his public victory at the steakhouse. The moment we stepped inside, he headed straight for the master bathroom, leaving a trail of clothes on the hardwood floor. The sound of the shower running became my cue. For 5 years, I had packed his bags for every business trip and weekend getaway. It was an ingrained habit, a piece of domestic routine I maintained to keep our household running efficiently. I pulled his expensive dark leather weekender down from the top closet shelf and began folding his clothes with mechanical precision. He had claimed this was a rugged guy's fishing trip, so I went looking for his specialized gear in the hall closet. I found absolutely nothing. Returning to the bedroom, I slowly unzipped the hidden interior compartment of his travel bag, expecting to find his fishing license or tackle accessories. Instead, my fingers brushed against smooth, glossy paper. I pulled out a heavy ivory envelope bearing the logo of a luxury travel concierge. There was not a single fishing lure, waterproof jacket, or piece of outdoor equipment in sight. The compartment held an entirely different kind of preparation. My heart beat a steady, unhurried rhythm against my ribs as I opened the flap. I was not operating on panic. I was operating on a sudden, chilling clarity. I reached inside and pulled out the contents, laying them flat on our pristine white duvet. Staring up at me were 2 first-class boarding passes to Cabo San Lucas, departing this Friday. The first passenger name was Carter. The second name, printed in bold black ink, was Riley. I knew exactly who she was. Riley was a 25-year-old junior sales representative who worked directly under his supervision. She had recently joined his regional sales team fresh out of college, always laughing a little too loudly at his mediocre jokes during company mixers. But the boarding passes were only the first layer of the betrayal. Tucked beneath the tickets was a heavy embossed receipt from a high-end jeweler on the Magnificent Mile. The purchase was dated 2 days ago. It detailed a custom diamond tennis bracelet totaling $15,000. Carter had charged it to a card I did not recognize, but the billing address was our home. He was not just taking a subordinate on a luxury international vacation, he was showering her with diamonds. The sheer audacity of it left a bitter taste in my mouth. He had stood in that private dining room just an hour ago, throwing his credit card at me and calling me a penny-pinching control freak. He weaponized my financial prudence to mask his extravagant infidelity. I took my phone from my pocket and methodically photographed the boarding passes, the travel itinerary, and the luxury jewelry receipt. Every angle, every barcode, every damning detail was captured and backed up to my secure cloud storage. A cold realization washed over me as I finally connected the staggering cost of first-class international flights and diamond jewelry. I dropped the papers on the bed and sprinted to my home office. I booted up my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard to log into our secure banking portal. I bypassed our checking accounts and went straight to the joint high-yield savings account. This was our fertility fund. I had spent the last 3 years working grueling overtime, redirecting my annual executive bonuses and cutting back on every personal luxury to build a $90,000 safety net for our upcoming in vitro fertilization treatments. The screen loaded. The balance read $450. I stared at the 3 digits, feeling the cold air completely leave my aching lungs. He had drained my literal future. He had stolen the money meant to build our family to finance a secret life with a junior employee. A truly sickening and painful memory flashed directly through my mind. Just last month, Carter had sighed heavily on our sofa, looking at me with feigned pity. He had told me that my extremely stressful career and advanced age were the reasons we were struggling to conceive. He blamed my ambition for my empty womb, wrapping his toxic manipulation in faux concern. All the while, he was actively emptying the very account designed to solve our fertility issues, siphoning my hard-earned money into his illicit luxury getaway fund. I closed the laptop, a terrifying cold calm settling over my entire body. I picked up my phone and dialed his mother. Brenda answered on the second ring, the background noise indicating she was already back at her own house. I injected a thick layer of trembling distress into my voice, playing the role of the confused, frightened wife perfectly. I told her I had just checked our accounts to pay a medical bill and noticed the $90,000 was gone. I asked if Carter had mentioned any emergency investments. Brenda let out a sharp, condescending sigh. She did not sound surprised. She sounded annoyed. "Madeline, please stop being so dramatic," she sneered through the receiver. "Successful men deal with high stakes all day. They need an outlet. Carter is under immense pressure, and Riley actually knows how to treat a man. She makes him feel respected, unlike some stressed-out executive who constantly emasculates him." The truth dropped like an anvil. The entire family was clearly in on the betrayal. Brenda knew about the stolen funds, she knew about the 25-year-old mistress, and she actively supported her son, draining my life savings to fund the affair. She told me to stop suffocating him and hung up the phone. I lowered the device from my ear. The shower down the hall abruptly turned off. I wiped my face completely clean of any emotion. The time for being a loving, supportive wife was officially over right now. The bathroom door cracked open, releasing a cloud of steam into the hallway. Carter strolled out with a towel wrapped carelessly around his waist, humming a cheerful tune. I simply smiled, zipped up his weekender bag, and told him everything was packed and ready for his big fishing trip. He patted my cheek entirely, oblivious to the absolute war room my mind had just become, and eventually went to sleep. The moment his heavy snores filled the master bedroom, I slipped out and locked myself in the basement study. I did not shed a single tear. The wounded wife routine was dead and buried. Instead, I pulled out my phone and dialed my 28-year-old sister Cassidy. She answered immediately, her voice groggy but alert. I told her I needed her and her husband Jamal right away. Jamal was 30 years old, an African-American man with a brilliant analytical mind who worked as an elite cybersecurity expert for a major financial firm downtown. Within 45 minutes, the soft crunch of tires on gravel signaled their arrival. They slipped through the back patio door under the cover of the chilly Chicago night. Cassidy pulled me into a fierce, silent hug, her eyes blazing with protective fury. Jamal set his heavy titanium laptop bag on my kitchen island, his face deadly serious. He did not ask for the emotional details or offer empty platitudes. He simply asked for our network password and my permission to dig. I poured us all strong black coffee as Jamal quickly established a secure connection to our residential router. Carter possessed an incredibly inflated sense of his own intelligence, but when it came to basic digital hygiene, he was remarkably arrogant and lazy. He conducted all of his shady financial maneuvering and secret communications directly over our shared wireless network, without even bothering to use a virtual private network. Because my name was on the Internet Service Provider account, Jamal was legally authorized to pull the raw network logs and inspect every byte of traffic flowing through our home system. His fingers danced rapidly across his illuminated keyboard, pulling up screens filled with cascading lines of code and IP addresses. We needed to know exactly where my $90,000 fertility fund had been transferred. Jamal isolated the bank packet data from earlier that afternoon, tracing the digital breadcrumbs Carter had carelessly left behind. The funds had not just vanished into thin air or been withdrawn as cash. They had been routed through a series of rapid online transfers, bouncing from our joint savings into a newly formed corporate holding account registered in Delaware. Jamal bypassed the basic corporate cloaking, digging into the public registration records tied to that specific routing number. He discovered the holding company was connected to a newly minted limited liability corporation. Carter was actively moving my money to establish an entirely separate financial entity, thinking his digital footprints were completely invisible to me. As Jamal continued his digital sweep, his eyes suddenly narrowed, scanning a completely different set of data packets. The rhythmic clicking of his keyboard stopped. He looked up at me, his expression shifting from focused intensity to outright alarm. It turned out Carter was not just a cheating thief. He was actively committing corporate espionage. Jamal pointed to a highlighted section of the network logs on his monitor. He explained that over the past 3 weeks, Carter's personal laptop had been repeatedly pinging the secure encrypted servers of my boutique hotel group. Because I occasionally worked from home and logged into the corporate mainframe, our network had recognized the pathways. Carter had managed to swipe my administrative login credentials. The log showed he had been initiating massive unauthorized data transfers in the middle of the night while I slept. He was not just browsing emails, he had systematically downloaded my entire proprietary VIP client database. This was a highly classified, heavily guarded registry containing the private contact information, spending habits, and corporate event budgets of Chicago's wealthiest hospitality clients. It was the absolute crown jewel of my career, the very reason I had been promoted to vice president. Carter was actively stealing the proprietary lifeblood of my company, harvesting thousands of top-tier corporate event contacts, and transferring the encrypted files directly onto his own external hard drives. He was preparing to walk away with my money and my professional livelihood. I stared at the glowing laptop screen as the truly devastating scale of his betrayal clicked into place. The pieces of the puzzle formed a terrifying, premeditated picture. Carter and Riley were not just running away to Mexico for a romantic vacation. They were using my stolen $90,000 fertility fund as untraceable startup capital to launch their own rival hospitality supply firm. That Delaware holding company Jamal uncovered was the financial shell for their new business venture. They planned to use my stolen VIP database to immediately poach my top clients, undercutting my hotel group with insider pricing knowledge. Carter intended to use the very contacts I had cultivated over a decade to instantly legitimize his new company. He was literally building his new life on the foundation of my stolen assets and my stolen professional connections. His master plan was to drain my bank accounts, leverage my corporate secrets, to build his own wealth with his young mistress, completely sabotage my standing as vice president, and then discard me once his new empire was fully operational. He wanted to leave me entirely bankrupt, unemployed, and facing potential legal ruin from a massive corporate data breach tied to my login credentials. He thought he was executing a flawless, uncatchable scheme to destroy my life. But he made a fatal error. He deeply underestimated me, and he completely failed to account for the digital fortress Jamal was about to build around his incoming destruction. The final shreds of my broken heart withered and hardened into cold, impenetrable steel. Any lingering grief I felt for my shattered marriage evaporated instantly, replaced by the ruthless precision of a corporate executive preparing for absolute warfare. I was no longer a betrayed wife mourning a 5-year illusion. I was a vice president defending her empire against a hostile takeover. I stood up, walked away from the glowing monitor, and poured myself a glass of ice water, letting the freezing liquid ground my racing thoughts. The sheer audacity of his plan demanded a response that would completely obliterate his professional future. I walked back to the kitchen island, placing my hands flat against the cool marble countertop. I looked directly into Jamal's eyes, matching his serious intensity with my own unyielding resolve. I did not want to just stop Carter from taking my files. I wanted to use his own greed against him. I asked Jamal a very specific, dangerous question. I wanted to know if we could weaponize the very data Carter was attempting to steal. Since Carter was too arrogant to realize his background downloads were currently paused in our network queue, I asked if we could alter the payload before it finished transferring to his external hard drive. Jamal leaned back in his chair, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across his face as the sheer genius of my counterattack registered. He cracked his knuckles, pulled his keyboard closer, and told me he could do much more than just alter it. Jamal immediately went to work, his fingers flying across the keys with breathtaking speed as he intercepted the remaining data packets Carter had queued for download. He expertly severed the connection to my authentic corporate server, ensuring my actual high-net-worth clients were entirely protected from any further exposure. In its place, Jamal rapidly constructed a sophisticated dummy database that looked exactly like my proprietary software. He populated this fake registry with thousands of fabricated client profiles. The names sounded incredibly prestigious, the event budgets looked mouth-wateringly massive, and the contact numbers were completely fake, linking only to dead ends and automated directories. To the untrained eye, it was a goldmine of hospitality industry secrets perfectly packaged for a startup firm looking to poach top-tier business. But Jamal did not stop at simply creating fraudulent data. He embedded a microscopic, undetectable digital tracking beacon deep within the file architecture. This beacon was designed to operate silently in the background, pinging a secure server Jamal controlled, the second those specific files were opened on any device. Carter thought he was downloading the master key to his glorious new future as a wealthy business owner. In reality, he was downloading a meticulously crafted digital Trojan horse filled with absolute garbage. Jamal seamlessly swapped the files in the transfer queue and resumed the download process. Carter's external hard drive, sitting quietly in his home office, innocently whirred back to life, happily ingesting the fabricated database without triggering a single local security alarm or warning. The crowning achievement of our digital trap was something Jamal called a legal poison pill. Carter was arrogant, but he was also fundamentally cheap, meaning he almost exclusively used his company-issued laptop for both his personal business and his clandestine startup planning. Jamal knew that corporate devices carried strict tracking and security protocols mandated by the IT department. He wrote a specialized, highly aggressive script and attached it directly to the dummy client database. This poison pill code was engineered to remain completely dormant until the exact moment Carter double-clicked the file folder to access his stolen treasure. Once triggered, the script would immediately bypass Carter's administrative privileges and send an automated high-priority red alert directly to the corporate compliance and legal departments at his current employer. It would flag his device for actively harboring stolen proprietary corporate data from a direct competitor, triggering an automatic lockdown of his entire machine. The moment Carter booted up his laptop in his luxurious Cabo San Lucas hotel room and tried to show his shiny new VIP list to his mistress, he would instantly detonate his own career. His corporate overlords would see the tracking beacon identify the massive data breach and freeze him out of their systems before he could even close the window. We were turning his own employer into the executioner. Jamal ran a final quick diagnostic check on the malicious code, gave a satisfied nod, and locked the hidden script securely into its final place. The trap was officially set, invisible and armed with lethal precision. Carter was sleeping soundly upstairs, dreaming of sandy beaches and a stolen fortune, completely unaware that he was about to carry a digital bomb across international lines. I walked over to the custom wine fridge built into the kitchen cabinetry and pulled out my most expensive bottle of vintage Retta Reserve I had been saving for a truly special occasion. My anniversary had been ruined, but my liberation was absolutely worth celebrating. I pulled 3 crystal goblets from the overhead rack and poured generous measures for myself, Cassidy, and Jamal. The deep ruby liquid caught the dim light of the kitchen as I passed the glasses across the marble island. Cassidy smiled, a fierce, protective expression shining on her face, while Jamal closed his laptop with a sharp, satisfying click. We stood together in the quiet sanctuary of my home, bound by blood loyalty and a shared mission of righteous vengeance. I raised my crystal glass high, feeling an overwhelming surge of powerful, unadulterated anticipation coursing through my veins. The tears were completely gone, replaced by the thrilling promise of absolute justice. We clinked our glasses together, the delicate chiming sound ringing out like a final devastating death knell for my sham of a marriage. We toasted in hushed voices to the impending spectacular and absolute destruction of Carter's life, knowing his arrogant quest for ultimate freedom would bring him nothing but complete ruin. As the metallic clink of our glasses faded into the quiet kitchen, my mind shifted to the ultimate trump card I had been holding close to my chest. Carter strutted through our daily life under the delusion that he held ultimate authority over our living situation simply because his signature sat on the original residential lease. He frequently used that piece of paper as a psychological weapon, reminding me during minor disagreements that his name secured this luxury property. He felt entirely secure in his domestic kingdom. What my arrogant husband failed to realize was that legal tenancy and actual ownership were two entirely different stratospheres of power. 3 months prior, my beloved great-aunt had passed away, leaving me a substantial private inheritance strictly in my name. Knowing Carter's propensity for reckless spending, I never disclosed the windfall. Instead, I quietly utilized an anonymous trust to execute a massive real estate maneuver. I purchased the exact property management firm that owned our entire block of premium townhouses. I was no longer just his wife sharing a leased space. I was the supreme shareholder of the holding company. I was quite literally his landlord. He had been paying his half of the rent directly into an account that eventually funneled right back to my asset portfolio. This secret drastically altered the entire power dynamic of our impending separation. While Carter plotted to steal my savings and leave me scrambling for an apartment, I already held the absolute legal authority to strip the roof right off over his head. Thursday morning arrived with a crisp, biting wind off Lake Michigan perfectly matching my demeanor. I bypassed my hotel corporate office entirely and took a private elevator up to the top floor of a towering glass skyscraper in the Loop. I walked into the sleek minimalist boardroom of Chicago's most ruthless financial and real estate attorney. He was a notorious legal predator, a man who specialized in dismantling fraudulent assets and orchestrating airtight evictions. I did not waste a single second on pleasantries. I dropped a thick manila folder and a secure encrypted flash drive directly onto the center of his polished glass desk. I laid out the meticulous paper trail of the stolen $90,000 fertility fund, mapping the exact timeline of Carter's unauthorized transfers. Next, I presented Jamal's pristine network logs, showcasing the undeniable proof of corporate espionage and the systematic theft of my highly classified VIP client database. I watched the attorney's eyes scan the digital timestamps and bank routing numbers. He analyzed the sheer magnitude of my husband's criminal stupidity with clinical precision. Carter had left a neon sign pointing directly to his illicit activities. The attorney leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers as he processed the comprehensive evidence of theft, infidelity, and corporate treason. I told him I needed maximum retaliation, utilizing every single legal mechanism at his disposal to ensure my husband would never financially or professionally recover from this catastrophic miscalculation. The attorney slowly let a predatory razor-sharp smile spread across his face as he reviewed the specific details of Carter's new corporate filing. He tapped a manicured finger against the LLC registration documents Jamal had pulled from the public database. Carter, in his frantic rush to establish a rival hospitality firm with his young mistress, had made a monumentally stupid logistical error. To save money on commercial registration fees, he had legally tethered his shady new business entity directly to our residential address. The attorney pointed out that this action explicitly violated strict municipal commercial business zoning laws. More importantly, it constituted a severe immediate breach of his residential lease agreement. The standard contract strictly prohibited tenants from operating an unapproved commercial enterprise or housing stolen corporate data on the premises. Because I owned the holding company, my attorney represented the landlord. We did not have to wait for a lengthy divorce proceeding to force him out of the townhouse. The lease violation granted us the immediate legal authority to bypass standard tenant protections. Carter had essentially handed me the exact loophole needed to legally execute a swift and merciless eviction. By tying his stolen funds and his fraudulent corporate espionage activities to the property, he had weaponized the lease against himself. The attorney confirmed that the holding company had absolute grounds for immediate removal based on illegal commercial activity. The trap was no longer just digital. It was now firmly rooted in unyielding real estate law. We immediately initiated the kill shot. I sat across from the attorney for 3 hours, drafting an impenetrable mountain of catastrophic legal paperwork. First, we finalized a 24-hour emergency eviction notice citing the egregious commercial lease violations and illegal business operations. Second, we prepared a comprehensive set of divorce papers detailing the adultery, the stolen fertility funds, and the gross marital misconduct. Finally, we drafted an emergency ex parte injunction to be filed the moment the courthouse opened on Friday morning. This injunction, backed by the undeniable proof of the stolen $90,000, would legally compel the banks to instantly freeze all of Carter's personal checking savings and credit accounts. He would have zero access to any liquid capital. We synchronized the execution timeline with military precision. Carter was scheduled to depart for his Mexican getaway on Friday morning. Everything was perfectly primed to activate the exact second his commercial flight took off from the runway. While he was trapped in a metal tube cruising at 30,000 feet, utterly unreachable and completely powerless, my legal team would strike. The eviction notice would be served, the bank accounts would be locked down, and the divorce would be filed. He was flying off under the delusion of ultimate freedom and supreme dominance. He had no idea that the ground beneath his feet was already gone. I shook the attorney's hand, walked out of the skyscraper, and prepared to play my role as the blissfully ignorant wife one last time. The transition from the towering glass skyscraper back to the quiet domesticity of my kitchen required a masterful shift in demeanor. Friday morning arrived with a blinding glare, reflecting off the frost-covered windows, mirroring the sharp tension humming beneath my skin. Carter bounded down the hardwood stairs at 7 sharp, radiating a sickeningly bright energy. He had swapped his usual tailored business suits for expensive, relaxed resort wear, looking every inch the man preparing to conquer a tropical paradise. He strutted around the granite island, loudly humming the same obnoxious tune from the night he packed his bag as he aggressively shoved a set of freshly polished golf clubs into a heavy-duty reinforced travel case. His absolute arrogance was suffocating, filling every cubic inch of our luxury townhouse. He truly believed he was the smartest person in any room, orchestrating a flawless double life right under my nose. After wrestling the zipper closed on his travel bag, he turned to me with a condescending smirk. He reached out and patronizingly patted my cheek, his fingers lingering just a fraction too long. He casually instructed me to make sure I deep-cleaned the guest bathrooms and organized his winter coats while he was away on his grueling, rugged fishing excursion. To top off the performance, he adjusted his designer sunglasses and smoothly lied straight to my face, insisting that he would be entirely off the grid and would absolutely not have any cell service out on the water. I absorbed his pathetic lies without allowing a single muscle in my face to twitch out of place. I played my role as the dutiful, oblivious wife with an Oscar-worthy execution. I forced a warm, gentle smile to my lips, burying the absolute inferno of rage burning behind my eyes. Moving to the espresso machine, I methodically prepared his favorite dark roast blend, securing the lid on his insulated travel mug. I walked over and handed the steaming coffee directly into his waiting hand, ensuring my grip was steady and my gaze was entirely open and supportive. He took a sip, completely blind to the lethal calculations turning over in my mind. I adjusted the collar of his lightweight jacket, smoothing down the premium fabric with mock affection, relishing the dramatic irony of the moment. I told him he had been working incredibly hard lately and deserved a break from the stresses of his daily life. I looked deeply into his eyes, projecting nothing but complete sincerity as I delivered my final line of our 5-year marriage. I told him to go out there and enjoy every single moment of his freedom. He chuckled, clearly thrilled by my gullibility, and promised he would catch a trophy fish just for me. He grabbed the handle of his weekender bag and his golf clubs, turning his back on me to head toward the entryway. He was so consumed by the thrill of his impending rendezvous with Riley that he completely failed to notice the predatory chill settling over the room. The heavy, solid oak front door slammed shut behind him, the sharp metallic click of the deadbolt echoing like a gunshot through the silent foyer. The sheer finality of that sound reverberated in my chest. I did not immediately move. I stood perfectly, unnervingly still in the center of the kitchen, counting the seconds in my head with rhythmic, mechanical precision. 1, 2, 3. I focused my hearing on the street outside, filtering out the ambient hum of the stainless steel refrigerator. 4, 5, 6. The muted rumble of a black luxury Uber pulling away from the curb vibrated through the frosted window panes. 7, 8, 9. I listened as the tires crunched over the icy pavement, the engine noise steadily fading as the vehicle accelerated down the pristine suburban street. 10. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and entirely mine. The toxic presence that had suffocated this house for years was officially in transit. The meticulously constructed illusion of Carter's perfect life was currently rolling down the highway toward the airport, entirely disconnected from the reality of the impending slaughter. He was locked in a moving vehicle, completely unaware that the invisible countdown timer on his stolen empire had just struck 0. The suffocating weight of my domestic prison lifted instantly, replaced by the cold, calculating adrenaline of a corporate executioner. The time for acting was over, and the moment for absolute retaliation had finally arrived. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out my phone, the screen glowing brightly in the quiet kitchen. I pulled up the encrypted messaging app and opened the chat thread with the ruthless real estate attorney I had met with the day before. Without a single ounce of hesitation, I typed a single decisive word: execute. I watched the read receipt confirm delivery, knowing that the emergency eviction notice, the devastating divorce papers, and the catastrophic bank freezes were instantly being filed with the local courts, effectively wiping out his financial existence. Next, I switched over to the secure channel established with my brother-in-law. Jamal had been standing by all morning monitoring the digital traffic. I sent him his specific launch command: arm the servers. In a fraction of a second, the tracking beacon embedded in the dummy VIP database went fully live, and the legal poison pill code was primed to instantly detonate Carter's entire corporate existence the moment he opened his laptop in Mexico. With the legal and cyber traps successfully sprung, I moved to the final phase of my master plan. I bypassed my text messages and placed a direct voice call to a specialized rapid response relocation team I had quietly retained on a massive retainer. The dispatcher answered on the first ring, awaiting my final confirmation. I stared around the luxurious townhouse, my voice completely devoid of any emotion as I gave the order. I told them to bring the moving trucks and to bring them right now. Exactly 58 minutes after I ended the call, a fleet of 3 unmarked heavy-duty box trucks roared onto my quiet suburban street, their air brakes hissing loudly as they parked in tight formation. A specialized crew of 12 burly, highly efficient relocation experts piled out, practically jogging up my front steps. They did not ask questions. They were paid a massive premium for speed, discretion, and absolute obedience. I met the crew chief at the threshold, armed with a clipboard and a meticulously color-coded floor plan I had drafted the night before. I pointed directly toward the master bedroom, the basement man cave, and the hall closets. I instructed them to strip the house of anything and everything belonging to my soon-to-be ex-husband. They moved with terrifying, beautiful military precision. A wave of men swept through my pristine townhouse, navigating the expensive furniture without causing a single scratch, zeroing in solely on Carter's existence. I stood in the center of the foyer, acting as an elite battlefield commander orchestrating a domestic strike. I pointed a single finger at his framed golf photographs, his custom leather recliner, his ridiculous collection of imported cigars, and his designer shoe racks. If Carter bought it, touched it, or claimed ownership of it, it was systematically ripped from the walls and shelves. The rapid thud of heavy boots, echoing against the hardwood floors, became the chaotic, glorious soundtrack of my liberation. They worked with ruthless efficiency, clearing out the physical manifestations of a man who thought he owned me. Up in the master suite, I watched with immense, unbridled satisfaction as the crew tackled his offensively overpriced wardrobe. Carter prized his appearance above all else, regularly boasting about his custom-tailored Italian threads and expensive accessories. Now his $2,000 silk suits, crisp Egyptian cotton dress shirts, and imported cashmere ties were unceremoniously yanked from their velvet hangers. The movers did not bother with protective garment bags or delicate folding techniques. They grabbed everything in massive, careless fistfuls and shoved them aggressively into the cheapest, thinnest corrugated cardboard boxes available. I walked over to his velvet-lined accessory drawer, scooping up his collection of heavy diamond-encrusted luxury watches and gold cufflinks, dropping them into a plastic grocery bag like worthless trinkets, before tossing them into a crate of tangled charging cables. Downstairs, the crew dismantled his precious high-end gaming consoles, ripping the HDMI cords from the wall and tossing the sleek white machines into boxes alongside his scattered gym shoes and half-empty protein powder tubs. With every taped-up box that passed by me on a heavy metal hand truck, I felt a physical suffocating weight lifting entirely from my chest. For 5 years, his bloated ego had consumed every square inch of this property, slowly draining my energy and suppressing my identity. Now I was watching the tangible debris of a deeply toxic parasitic marriage being violently purged from my sanctuary. The oppressive atmosphere he cultivated vanished completely, packed away into flimsy brown cartons, headed straight for permanent exile. The loaded trucks departed the townhouse in a synchronized convoy, rumbling south toward a destination far removed from the manicured lawns of our affluent neighborhood. I had personally driven out to the far south side 2 days prior, specifically searching for the most desolate, dilapidated industrial park I could safely locate. I found exactly what I needed in a sprawling, rusted corrugated metal complex nestled beneath a roaring highway overpass. The facility was entirely non-climate controlled, meaning Carter's expensive electronics and delicate silk suits would be subjected to the brutal freezing Chicago winter air and the inevitable damp, musty thaw of spring. The moving crew backed their trucks up to a grimy, oil-stained rolling door and began dumping the boxes onto the cracked concrete floor of the small 10-by-10 unit. They stacked the cardboard haphazardly, crushing the cheaper boxes under the immense weight of his disassembled leather recliner and golf training equipment. There was zero organization and zero care given to his prized possessions. Once the final box of his miserable life was shoved inside, the heavy metal door was slammed downward with a deafening metallic screech. I walked into the dimly lit, barred leasing office and slapped my credit card onto the scratched laminate counter. I prepaid the rental fee for exactly 1 month, ensuring that if he did not pay the subsequent bills, his entire curated life would be legally auctioned off to the highest bidder. I locked the heavy brass padlock myself, slipping the only existing key deep into my coat pocket. By the time I returned to the townhouse, the sun was beginning its descent, casting long, triumphant shadows across the empty driveway. Jamal was already waiting on the front porch, flanked by a 3-man private security tech crew carrying heavy steel toolboxes. I gave them the green light, and they immediately went to work systematically dismantling the physical vulnerabilities of the property. The old deadbolts and brass door handles, the ones Carter's key still perfectly fit, were aggressively drilled out and tossed into the recycling bin. In their place, Jamal's technicians installed heavy-duty military-grade biometric locking mechanisms on the front entrance, the back patio, and the garage interior access door. These sleek black titanium scanners required a highly specific encrypted thumbprint and a rotating digital passcode to disengage the reinforced steel latch. Jamal integrated the new hardware directly into my upgraded home network, linking the perimeter defense to a series of high-definition, motion-activated cameras capturing every possible angle of the property. The entire installation took less than 2 hours, transforming my previously vulnerable home into an impenetrable digital and physical fortress. I pressed my thumb against the cool glass of the new scanner, listening to the satisfying heavy electronic thud of the steel bolt snapping firmly into place. I stood in the center of my perfectly silent, immaculately clean living room, breathing in the fresh, uncontaminated air. The locks were changed, his possessions were banished, and his digital footprint was completely annihilated. Carter had officially been erased. I stood in the center of the hallway, letting the sound of the running shower wash over me, as I systematically dismantled the emotional facade I had maintained for 5 years. I dropped the role of the confused, wounded wife entirely. The trembling fear vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating anger that demanded immediate, ruthless action. I picked up my phone and bypassed the contacts for my parents or friends. Instead, I dialed my 28-year-old sister Cassidy. She answered on the first ring, sensing the absolute urgency in my hushed voice. I did not waste time on tears or long-winded explanations. I simply told her I had been robbed by my husband and that I needed her and Jamal at my house immediately. Jamal, her 30-year-old husband, was not just a supportive brother-in-law. He was an elite, highly sought-after cybersecurity expert who managed digital infrastructure for a top-tier intelligence firm. Within 30 minutes, a dark sedan pulled silently into my driveway. The headlights cut to avoid drawing any attention. Cassidy and Jamal slipped through the back patio door under the cover of the brisk night air, moving with the quiet urgency of a specialized strike team. Cassidy pulled me into a fierce, wordless embrace, her eyes scanning my face for any sign of a breakdown. Jamal simply set his heavy, reinforced laptop bag on the kitchen counter, his expression completely unreadable as he waited for my command. Jamal unzipped his bag and pulled out his specialized equipment, turning my kitchen island into a makeshift digital command center. He asked for my explicit permission to access our residential router, ensuring every action he took was legally protected under my name as the primary account holder. I gave him the green light, and he instantly connected to our home network. Carter was a man who believed his own intelligence was vastly superior to everyone around him, but his arrogance made him incredibly careless. He conducted all of his illicit financial planning and secret communications directly over our shared Wi-Fi without ever bothering to use a basic virtual private network or encrypted tunneling. Jamal easily bypassed the standard residential security protocols and began legally pulling the raw network logs. He was looking for the exact digital pathway my stolen fertility funds had taken. His fingers flew across the keyboard, isolating the data packets transmitted during the brief window when the $90,000 vanished from the high-yield savings account. The screen illuminated with lines of code, IP addresses, and routing numbers painting a clear picture of Carter's sloppy digital footprints. Jamal tracked the massive transfer, watching the money bounce from our joint account into a newly established out-of-state holding company. Carter had not just withdrawn cash. He had electronically wired my entire future into a hidden corporate entity, completely unaware that his every keystroke had been permanently recorded on the very router he paid for. As Jamal continued his meticulous digital sweep of the network traffic, his rhythmic typing suddenly stopped. He leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes narrowing as he isolated a massive anomaly-heavy data stream originating from Carter's personal laptop. He looked up at me, the professional detachment fading into genuine alarm. Jamal revealed that he had uncovered something far worse than standard financial infidelity. Carter had not merely stolen my personal savings, he was actively committing high-level corporate espionage. Jamal brought up a detailed log showing Carter's IP address aggressively and repeatedly pinging the secure encrypted servers of my luxury hotel group. Because I frequently worked from home, our network had trusted pathways to the corporate mainframe. Carter had somehow bypassed my basic security measures and stolen my administrative login credentials. The data logs provided undeniable, time-stamped proof that he had been systematically downloading my highly classified VIP client database directly from the hotel's private server. He was actively harvesting thousands of proprietary files containing the confidential contact information, spending histories, and corporate event budgets of Chicago's most elite clientele. He was pulling the very lifeblood of my company, the exact asset I had spent my entire career building, and transferring the encrypted files directly onto his own personal hard drives. The staggering scale of the theft was breathtaking. Carter was not just planning to leave me. He was executing a calculated digital heist designed to completely decimate my professional standing. I stared at the cascading lines of data on Jamal's screen, and suddenly the entire horrifying scope of Carter's betrayal slammed into terrifying focus. Every disjointed piece of the puzzle connected to reveal his ultimate motive. Carter and his 25-year-old subordinate Riley were not just running off for a romantic getaway in Cabo. They were using my stolen $90,000 IVF fund as untraceable startup capital to launch a direct rival hospitality supply firm. That hidden holding company Jamal had uncovered was the financial shell for their new business venture. Carter intended to use my stolen VIP database to instantly legitimize his new company, poaching my top corporate clients and undercutting my hotel group with stolen insider knowledge. He was literally building his new empire on the foundation of my stolen assets and my stolen professional connections. He planned to completely ruin my career, trigger a massive corporate data breach tied directly to my administrative credentials, steal the money meant for our future children, and dump me in the resulting wreckage. His master plan was to leave me entirely bankrupt, unemployed, and facing potential legal ruin while he lived luxuriously with his young mistress. The sheer sociopathic cruelty of his strategy was staggering. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the last remaining trace of my former self harden into impenetrable ice. He thought he had orchestrated the perfect destruction of my life, but he had no idea the war had just begun. The crisp, unnerving silence of my Saturday morning was violently shattered just before 9 o'clock. Heavy, aggressive pounding echoed through the grand foyer, rattling the frosted glass panels of my newly reinforced front door. I did not need to check the high-definition security feed to know exactly who was launching this desperate suburban siege. Carter's parents, Richard and Brenda, had arrived. They stood on my pristine blue stone porch, their faces flushed with indignant rage, demanding immediate entry. Richard repeatedly jammed his thumb into the illuminated doorbell, while Brenda practically hammered her manicured fists against the heavy oak frame. Their voices, usually dripping with country club elitism and condescension, were now pitched into a frantic, shrill screech that echoed down the quiet, tree-lined street. They were loudly demanding to know why their precious son was currently stranded in a foreign country, without a single functioning line of credit. Carter had clearly called them in an absolute panic from Mexico after discovering his bank accounts were entirely locked down and drained of liquid assets. He had undoubtedly fed them some fabricated sob story playing the ultimate victim of a vindictive, crazy wife. Richard yelled through the thick door, ordering me to open up and fix the terrible banking error I had supposedly caused. He bellowed that Carter was facing extreme public humiliation at a luxury resort. They expected me to simply bow my head, unlock the fortress, and instantly restore their golden boy's unlimited access to my financial portfolio. I remained perfectly still in the center of the foyer, holding my phone and watching their pathetic meltdown unfold on the crystal-clear high-definition security feed. I absolutely refused to disengage the military-grade biometric locks, to let those toxic enablers step 1 foot inside my sanctuary. Instead, I tapped the microphone icon on my screen, activating the two-way audio system integrated into the smart doorbell. My voice projected outward completely flat and devoid of any emotional warmth slicing through the crisp winter air. I calmly informed them that they were trespassing on private property and instructed them to immediately step away from the entrance. Brenda gasped dramatically at the sound of my disembodied voice, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. She leaned directly into the camera lens, her eyes flashing with venomous intent. She began screaming a barrage of vicious threats, swearing that she would completely destroy my personal and professional reputation across every social circle in Chicago. She declared I was a monster for deliberately starving her son in Mexico, painting a ridiculous picture of Carter wasting away on a pristine sun-drenched beach. She promised to call my corporate superiors, my clients, and every mutual friend we shared, to expose me as a vindictive, unstable woman who was maliciously withholding funds from her hardworking husband. She ranted about my supposed cruelty, totally blinded by the delusional belief that she held the ultimate upper hand in this domestic war. I let Brenda exhaust her lungs, allowing her shrieking threats to hang in the frigid morning air for a few agonizing seconds. I did not raise my voice or offer a single syllable of defense. Instead, I utilized the exact digital weapon Jamal had helped me secure weeks prior. With a few swift taps on my smartphone, I accessed a specific audio file hidden deep in my encrypted drive. I bypassed the standard intercom microphone and routed the raw audio directly through the powerful exterior speaker system we had just installed. The crisp, undeniable sound of Brenda's own voice suddenly blasted across the entire suburban block. It was a recording from a supposedly private lunch she had shared with Carter 3 weeks ago. In the crystal-clear audio, Brenda was cheerfully congratulating her son on finding a much younger, more vibrant companion. Even worse, the recording captured her explicitly advising Carter on the best way to quietly funnel the $90,000 fertility fund out of our joint accounts without triggering any fraud alerts. The entire neighborhood was instantly treated to the sound of Richard chuckling in the background, fully endorsing the theft of my money to finance Carter's illicit getaway with his mistress. I cranked the volume to the absolute maximum. The horrifying proof of their deep complicity echoed off the neighboring houses, exposing their profound moral bankruptcy to every resident currently walking their dog or retrieving their morning newspaper. The shock value was absolute and instantaneous. The color instantly drained from both of their faces as the recording abruptly ended, leaving a deafening, terrifying silence in its wake. Brenda stumbled backward, her manicured hands flying to cover her mouth in absolute horror, realizing the entire affluent neighborhood had just heard her orchestrate a massive financial crime against her own daughter-in-law. Richard looked physically ill, his aggressive bravado entirely evaporating as he stared wide-eyed at the small blinking camera lens. I activated my microphone one final time, my tone dripping with lethal precision. I informed them that the audio file was already in the possession of Chicago's most ruthless litigation attorney. I stated very clearly that they had exactly 5 seconds to turn around, walk to their vehicle, and permanently vacate my property. I laid out the ultimate ultimatum, promising that if they ever attempted to contact me again, I would officially name both of them as active co-conspirators in a massive civil fraud and embezzlement lawsuit. I guaranteed I would drag their pristine country club reputation through a brutal, highly publicized legal battle that would completely decimate their retirement savings. The countdown began. 1, 2. They did not wait for 3. Richard grabbed his wife by the arm, and they practically scrambled down the bluestone pathway, nearly tripping over themselves in their haste. They threw themselves into their luxury sedan, the tires screeching against the asphalt as they fled in absolute terror, utterly broken and thoroughly humiliated. The humid air in the luxury Cabo resort suite felt stifling, in suffocating contrast to the breezy tropical paradise just beyond the glass balcony doors. Carter sat on the edge of the plush, king-sized bed, his posture rigid with a mix of adrenaline and desperate greed. Riley was asleep in the adjacent room, entirely unaware that their expensive getaway was about to become the epicenter of a catastrophic financial collapse. Carter ignored the lingering guilt and the mounting anxiety of the credit card declines he had suffered earlier that afternoon. He was far too focused on his objective. He clicked the power button on his work laptop, the screen illuminating his face in the dim room as it cycled through the boot sequence. His hands shook slightly as he navigated the folders, his eyes scanning for the heavily encrypted labeled VIP_client_manifest_2026. He did not know that this file was merely a digital mirage, a carefully constructed piece of bait I had specifically designed to exploit his arrogance. He believed that by delivering this list to the black market broker waiting on his encrypted messaging channel, he would secure an immediate, untraceable cash advance to cover their mounting resort debts. He hovered his cursor over the file, convinced that he was moments away from pulling off the ultimate power move that would solidify his financial independence and leave me with absolutely nothing. Miles away in the dim glow of my home office, Jamal sat hunched over a bank of monitors, his eyes tracking a pulsating red cursor that moved through the virtual network tunnels. He held a lukewarm coffee in one hand, his posture entirely focused on the incoming data streams from our remote connection in Cabo. Suddenly, the screen flickered, indicating the specific access point he had been waiting for all evening. Carter had initiated the file transfer. Jamal watched with clinical fascination as Carter blindly initiated the VIP_client_manifest_2026 file, completely unaware that he had just stepped into a high-tech mousetrap. As soon as Carter clicked the file, the poison pill I had instructed Jamal to embed went active. The script was not designed to simply transmit the data. It was programmed to execute a deep system override that would immediately ping back the exact MAC address of the device being used, while simultaneously corrupting any further attempts at data transmission. Jamal watched the background processes light up, indicating that the system was now silently harvesting Carter's own system metadata. We were no longer just catching him in the act of theft. We were effectively turning his own machine into a tracking device that would provide the irrefutable court-admissible evidence required for the federal authorities to initiate an immediate arrest warrant. The reaction within the corporate IT infrastructure was as swift as it was brutal. As soon as the poison pill bypassed the local network and synced with the main hotel group server in Chicago, a global security alert triggered across every terminal in the corporate building. Sirens blared silently in the form of flashing red notification banners on every IT security monitor, alerting the specialized internal response team to a major breach in progress. The network security protocols designed by the very firm I had hired recognized the unauthorized access attempt from an unrecognized foreign IP address in Mexico. The system instantly engaged the Scorched Earth protocol, remotely triggering a hard lockdown on Carter's laptop. The screen on his computer went black, then flashed a series of emergency administrative commands, effectively bricking the operating system to prevent further document tampering. Behind the scenes, the forensic software was already working in tandem with the breach notification, permanently capturing the device's geolocation, coordinates the physical IP address assigned to the resort's router, and a comprehensive, unalterable log of the specific files he had attempted to exfiltrate. The trap had not only locked him out of his illicit business venture, it had successfully generated a digital signature that would effectively anchor him to the scene of the crime for every investigator currently preparing their case file. The final blow to Carter's fragile world arrived in the form of a buzzing smartphone resting on the nightstand. Carter snatched the device, expecting a notification about a pending wire transfer from his broker, but his face paled as he saw the name of his current CEO flashing on the caller ID. He swiped to answer, his voice already pitching into a frantic, high-pitched defense, but he was silenced within seconds. The CEO, his tone dripping with a mixture of professional disgust and cold rage, delivered the final verdict of Carter's tenure. The conversation lasted barely 2 minutes. It was a clinical, brutal termination executed with the precision of a guillotine. He was informed that the internal investigation had already confirmed his active involvement in corporate espionage, identifying him as the source of the recent data breach. Every stolen file was currently being handed over to federal authorities, and he was explicitly told that the FBI had been notified of his specific location in Mexico. His company badges were deactivated, his stock options were voided, and he was formally warned that any attempt to return to the office would result in immediate arrest. Carter stood in the center of the dark, expensive suite, his phone still gripped tightly in his trembling hand. The silence of the room now filled with the crushing weight of a life that had completely, irrevocably evaporated. The crushing silence of the dark suite was broken by the sharp click of the bedroom door opening. Riley stood in the threshold, the soft ambient light from the hallway casting long shadows across her face. She had been woken by the frantic, pleading tone of Carter's voice during the brief phone call and had listened closely enough to hear the devastating finality of the CEO's words echoing through the phone's speaker. The sleepy, pampered mistress routine instantly vanished from her demeanor, replaced by a cold, sharp realization of the catastrophic reality unfolding before her eyes. She stared at Carter, who was still clutching the dead phone, his face a pale, sweating mask of absolute defeat. In that singular moment, the grand illusion he had so carefully constructed completely disintegrated into dust. Riley realized she was not standing across from a brilliant, wealthy corporate mastermind preparing to launch a rival hospitality empire. She was staring at a bankrupt, unemployed felon who had just committed high-level corporate treason and dragged her directly into the blast radius of a massive federal investigation. The Cabo getaway, the promises of luxury, the startup capital supposedly stolen from the IVF fund, it all crashed down around her in spectacular fashion. She recognized that the stolen wealth he had paraded around was entirely gone frozen and seized by the very authorities now hunting him. Her eyes narrowed with a terrifying, self-preserving clarity as she calculated the immediate legal and financial peril he had selfishly anchored to her life, knowing she had to cut ties immediately. The pristine, tranquil atmosphere of the luxury resort lobby was abruptly shattered 10 minutes later. Riley marched furiously past the cascading indoor waterfalls and imported marble pillars, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, as Carter scrambled frantically behind her, desperately begging her to keep her voice down. She spun around near the front desk, completely disregarding the elegant surroundings, and unleashed a torrent of vitriol that brought the entire lobby to a standstill. She screamed at him for being a pathetic, incompetent fraud, loudly exposing his corporate espionage and his stolen credit cards to every wealthy guest within earshot. She did not care who heard. Her only objective was to publicly sever herself from his sinking ship. The illusion of their romantic getaway was entirely obliterated, replaced by a spectacular, visceral meltdown. Carter tried to grab her arm, pleading for her to wait so he could explain, but she violently shoved him away, shouting that he was going to prison and she refused to go down with him. Several vacationing tourists, recognizing the sheer entertainment value of the chaotic scene, immediately pulled out their smartphones. The red recording lights blinked from multiple angles as guests eagerly captured the humiliating spectacle of a ruined man being brutally berated by his much younger mistress. Carter raised his hands to shield his face, completely humiliated, as Riley systematically tore apart his ego, his fake wealth, and his entire future in front of a captivated recording audience. Riley did not waste another breath on the broken man, cowering in front of the concierge desk. She had already hastily packed her designer luggage, shoving her belongings into the suitcases, with frantic, ruthless efficiency, before dragging them down to the lobby. Ignoring Carter's pathetic, tearful apologies, she marched directly to the front desk and demanded they call her a private car to the airport immediately. While Carter stammered weakly about figuring out a solution, Riley reached into the hidden compartment of her purse and pulled out a high-limit emergency credit card she kept strictly for her own self-preservation. Without a single glance in Carter's direction, she booked the next available first-class flight back to the States, ensuring her rapid escape from the unfolding disaster. When the hotel manager tentatively approached to inform Carter that his credit card on file for the luxury suite had just been completely declined and the reservation was formally canceled, Riley simply laughed. She grabbed the handle of her suitcase and walked toward the sliding glass exit doors. Carter reached out desperately, asking what he was supposed to do now that he had absolutely no money and no room. Riley paused for a fraction of a second, looked over her shoulder with eyes devoid of any sympathy, and told him to enjoy his federal indictment. She stepped into the waiting car, the doors shutting with a definitive thud, leaving Carter standing entirely alone in the lobby, surrounded by his luggage and absolute ruin. Carter stood utterly paralyzed in the center of the lavish Mexican resort, the crushing reality of his abandonment finally taking hold. The hotel security guards were already circling, their expressions hardened as they prepared to escort the bankrupt, non-paying guest off the pristine property. He had zero cash, no functioning credit cards, and a deactivated corporate phone that was practically useless for anything other than basic calls. Trembling uncontrollably, he sank onto a stone bench near the entrance and dialed the only people left on the planet who might blindly tolerate his catastrophic failures. He called his parents. When Richard answered, his voice was already thick with the terrifying realization of the morning's earlier events, having just fled from my property under the threat of a massive civil lawsuit. Carter did not have the luxury of pride. He immediately broke down into hyperventilating sobs. He frantically confessed that he had been fired, that Riley had abandoned him, and that the resort was physically throwing him out into the streets. Stripped of all his arrogant bravado, he begged his terrified father to wire funds immediately. He pleaded with them to drain whatever liquid savings they could safely access, just to purchase him a basic unrefundable economy class ticket back to Chicago. Carter, the man who had schemed to build a multi-million-dollar luxury hospitality empire using stolen funds, was now sobbing openly in a public courtyard, desperately bargaining for a miserable middle seat on a budget airline just to escape the tropical paradise that had become his ultimate prison. The agonizing reality of his new existence began the moment he squeezed his tall frame into the middle seat of a budget airline near the rear lavatory. 14 excruciating hours of delayed flights, missed connections, and screaming toddlers finally culminated in the heavy thud of the landing gear hitting the tarmac at O'Hare International Airport late Sunday evening. Carter was a physical wreck. The crisp, tailored linen suit he had worn to project the image of a wealthy CEO was now a wrinkled, sweat-stained mess, clinging uncomfortably to his skin. The tropical humidity of Mexico had been replaced by the biting chill of the Chicago wind piercing through the thin fabric as he trudged out of the terminal. His head throbbed with a relentless pounding ache, fueled by dehydration, sheer exhaustion, and an all-consuming venomous fury directed entirely at his wife. He blamed Madeline for every single catastrophe that had befallen him over the last 48 hours. In his twisted, narcissistic mind, her refusal to simply lay down and accept his financial theft was the sole cause of his corporate termination and Riley's humiliating departure. He tightened his grip on his battered carry-on bag, his knuckles turning white as he stormed through the crowded baggage claim area. He was absolutely determined to unleash a hurricane of rage upon her the second he walked through their front door, fully intending to punish her for daring to disrupt his meticulously crafted master plan. Dragging his luggage toward the chaotic pickup zone, Carter pulled out his heavily restricted personal smartphone. His thumbs hammered aggressively against the cracked screen as he navigated to the family group chat. He still clung to the delusional belief that his parents would rush to his side, that the protective bubble of his childhood would magically reappear and shield him from the harsh consequences of his actions. Ignoring the massive, glaring elephant in the room regarding his termination and his failed Mexican getaway, he opted for an infuriatingly casual tone. He typed out a brief, demanding message that perfectly encapsulated his staggering entitlement. "Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up?" He hit send, fully expecting Richard to immediately reply with an offer to bring the luxury SUV to the designated curb. He stood on the concrete island, shivering violently in the winter air, watching the 3 gray dots pulse on the screen, indicating someone was typing. He assumed his mother was drafting a frantic, overly concerned message about his safe arrival, eager to welcome her golden boy back to the safety of their affluent suburb. He felt a fleeting surge of his old arrogance return, convinced that no matter what disasters occurred, he would always have a loyal support system ready to cushion his fall and clean up his messes. He pocketed the phone, staring impatiently at the flow of incoming traffic, waiting for his rescue vehicle to arrive. The phone buzzed sharply in his pocket, breaking through his impatient vigil. He pulled it out, a smug smile forming on his lips as he swiped open the notification. The smile vanished instantly, replaced by a deep, sickening dread. The reply was not from Richard or Brenda. It was from Madeline. The message consisted of 2 cold, dismissive words. "Try Uber." Carter stared at the screen, his chest heaving with fresh outrage. He immediately scrolled down desperately, waiting for his parents to chime in and overrule her blatant disrespect. Minutes ticked by in agonizing silence. The screen remained completely inactive. Richard and Brenda, utterly paralyzed by the terrifying threat of Madeline's pending civil fraud lawsuit and the very real possibility of losing their pristine country club reputation, offered absolutely zero assistance. The golden boy had been formally abandoned by his enablers. A harsh gust of wind whipped across the pickup zone, forcing Carter to accept his brutal new reality. He opened his ride-sharing application with trembling, frozen fingers. His heart plummeted further as the screen refreshed. The Sunday evening rush combined with the severe weather had triggered a massive surge pricing alert. He had no choice. Swallowing the last bitter drop of his shattered pride, he authorized the exorbitant charge using the final remaining credit limit on his sole surviving personal card, watching his last financial lifeline completely evaporate into thin air. Carter practically threw himself into the back seat of the arriving sedan, slamming the heavy door shut with enough force to rattle the windows. He slouched against the inexpensive fabric upholstery, his arms crossed defensively over his chest, as the vehicle merged onto the congested highway leading out of the city. The entire ride was spent marinating in a toxic, escalating stew of vindictive rage. He watched the city skyline pass by in a blur, his mind racing with vicious, calculated scenarios designed to re-establish his ultimate dominance. He convinced himself that the house was his domain, entirely ignoring the fact that Madeline had contributed equally to the mortgage for half a decade. He meticulously plotted the exact words he would use to physically throw her out onto the street the moment he arrived. He imagined the satisfying sound of the deadbolts engaging behind her back, locking her out in the cold, while he reclaimed his territory. He built a fantasy where he would aggressively demand access to her personal funds to restore his depleted accounts, ready to use every ounce of emotional manipulation he possessed to break her will. He sat in the darkness of the back seat, feeding his bruised ego with delusions of a triumphant, forceful return to power. He was entirely consumed by his own arrogance, completely and utterly blind to the massive, impenetrable brick wall he was about to hit at full speed. The hired car finally pulled to a stop in front of the familiar Chicago townhouse, the tires crunching softly against the light dusting of fresh snow. Carter practically leaped from the back seat, grabbing his luggage with a violent jerk and storming up the bluestone pathway. He did not bother to cast a single glance back at the driver, his mind entirely consumed by the aggressive speech he had been rehearsing for the last hour. He marched up the front steps, his chest puffed out with a manufactured sense of supreme authority, ready to kick the front door open and reclaim his absolute dominance over the household. He reached into his coat pocket, retrieved his heavy metal keyring, and aggressively jammed his house key toward the brass cylinder. The metal scraped harshly against a completely flat surface. Carter paused, his brow furrowing in deep confusion, as he realized the familiar brass fixture was entirely missing. He blinked, shaking his head to clear the travel fatigue, and looked closer at the entryway. The entire locking mechanism had been surgically removed and seamlessly replaced by a sleek black biometric security pad that glowed with a faint pulsing blue light. The solid oak door had been heavily reinforced, lacking any traditional keyhole or manual entry point. He stared at the imposing piece of high-tech hardware, the first cold spike of genuine panic finally piercing through his thick layer of arrogant entitlement. Refusing to accept the immediate reality of his situation, Carter aggressively shoved his thumb flat against the glowing glass of the biometric scanner. He expected the heavy internal deadbolts to instantly slide back with a satisfying mechanical click. Instead, the console emitted a harsh, singular buzz, and the soft blue rim flashed a brilliant, unforgiving red. A small digital display illuminated above the sensor, projecting two brutally clear words: "Access denied." Carter let out a sharp gasp of frustration, his heart rate accelerating as the cold wind whipped around his thin suit. He frantically swiped his thumb across his jacket to wipe away the nervous sweat and jammed his print against the glass a second time. The red light flashed again, accompanied by the same aggressive rejection tone. Desperate, he shifted his focus to the illuminated digital keypad positioned just below the scanner. He rapidly punched in his old 6-digit security code, hitting the enter button with a forceful jab of his index finger. The system locked him out instantly, initiating a brief security cooldown sequence. The reality of his utter powerlessness finally shattered his delusions of control. He dropped his heavy luggage onto the porch and began pounding his bare fists violently against the reinforced oak, the sound echoing hollowly down the quiet street. He screamed Madeline's name at the top of his lungs, demanding she open the door and fix what he assumed was a ridiculous technological error, his voice cracking with rising hysteria. I sat comfortably in the warm glow of the living room, a generous pour of aged Cabernet resting lightly in my hand, watching Carter's spectacular meltdown unfold on the main tablet monitor. Jamal had integrated the exterior security feeds directly into the home automation system, giving me a crystal-clear high-definition view of Carter battering himself against the impenetrable front entrance. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the rich wine, savoring the absolute tranquility of my newly secured environment. I waited until his frantic pounding began to slow, his knuckles undoubtedly bruising against the solid wood, before I reached forward and tapped the microphone icon on the interface. A soft electronic chime sounded from the exterior speaker, instantly freezing Carter in his tracks. He whipped his head around, his eyes wide and bloodshot, searching desperately for the source of the noise. I leaned closely into the receiver, my voice projecting smoothly through the crisp winter air outside. I did not sound angry, hurt, or betrayed. My tone was laced with the breezy, polite detachment of a concierge addressing a particularly confused tourist. I asked him very clearly, "Can I help you, sir? You are currently trespassing on private property." Bye. The utter lack of emotion in my delivery hit him like a physical blow. He stared directly into the small camera lens mounted above the keypad, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock as he realized I was not playing the role of the devastated wife. The polite, icy detachment of my greeting triggered an immediate and terrifying explosion of pure, unadulterated rage. Carter completely lost his mind right there on the blue stone porch. His face twisted into a mask of furious, unhinged aggression, the veins bulging visibly against the sides of his neck. He lunged toward the camera spittle flying from his lips as he screamed that this was his house, furiously insisting that his name was securely attached to the mortgage and the title. He demanded I disengage the locks immediately, threatening to literally tear the oak door off its hinges and drag me out by my hair if I did not comply within the next 10 seconds. He bellowed that I had absolutely no legal right to change the hardware or deny him entry, attempting to project the fierce, commanding authority he had lost in Cabo. He rattled the heavy brass handle with both hands, kicking the base of the frame with his expensive leather shoes in a pathetic display of physical intimidation. I watched him expend the last remaining ounce of his travel-weary energy, my expression completely unmoved by his violent theatricality. I took one final relaxed sip of my wine, enjoying the rich notes dancing across my palate, and set the crystal glass gently onto the side table. I pressed the microphone icon for the final time, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm whisper. I simply replied, "I suggest you turn around." Carter spun around on his heels, his mouth already open to hurl another barrage of empty threats at the camera lens, but the words died in his throat. Standing at the bottom of the bluestone steps was Arthur Nelson, the famously tyrannical president of the Homeowners Association for our upscale, meticulously manicured community. Mr. Nelson was a retired corporate litigator who treated the neighborhood bylaws like a sacred religious text, and he possessed zero tolerance for any disruption of the suburban tranquility. Clad in a heavy wool overcoat and leather gloves, he marched up the pathway with the grim, unyielding determination of a general preparing to execute a court-martial. The violent screaming and aggressive door-pounding had echoed down the quiet, snow-dusted street, easily penetrating the thick glass windows of Mr. Nelson's adjacent property. Carter's face flushed a deep, embarrassed crimson as he frantically tried to adjust his wrinkled suit, desperately attempting to project an aura of calm professional authority. He opened his mouth to offer a charming, fabricated excuse about a lost key and a simple domestic misunderstanding, hoping to smooth over the humiliating public spectacle. Mr. Nelson, however, did not offer a polite evening greeting or inquire about the nature of the disturbance. His sharp, judgmental gaze swept over Carter's disheveled appearance, the abandoned luggage and the angry red mark forming on his temple, thoroughly unimpressed by the pathetic display of masculine aggression interrupting his quiet Sunday evening. Carter plastered on a fake apologetic smile, fully expecting the older man to reprimand me through the intercom for causing a neighborhood disturbance by locking out my own husband. Instead, Mr. Nelson completely ignored the security camera and focused his cold, authoritative stare entirely on the sweating, desperate man shivering on the porch. He reached into the inner pocket of his heavy overcoat and withdrew a thick, sealed manila envelope, thrusting it aggressively into Carter's chest. He commanded Carter to take it, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate or negotiation. Carter instinctively grabbed the heavy package, his brow furrowing as his eyes scanned the stark, bold lettering printed across the front. Mr. Nelson adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and delivered the devastating message with clinical precision, his breath pluming in the freezing winter air. He informed Carter that the official landlord of the property had contacted the HOA board earlier that afternoon to report an imminent security threat. Mr. Nelson explicitly stated that he had been formally deputized to hand-deliver this emergency eviction notice, alongside a court-approved temporary restraining order. The older man's voice carried the sharp, undeniable edge of a legal professional executing a flawless maneuver, making it brutally clear that this was not a neighborly dispute, but a binding legal action. He stared Carter down, confirming that the documents strictly prohibited him from coming within 500 feet of the premises, effective immediately upon delivery. A harsh, incredulous laugh erupted from Carter's throat as he ripped open the envelope, completely convinced that this was some sort of pathetic, misguided bluff. He sneered aggressively at Mr. Nelson, waving the thick stack of legal documents in the frigid air, loudly declaring that there had been a colossal administrative mistake. He vehemently claimed that his name was printed on the master lease, insisting that he was the primary tenant and primary breadwinner, making an eviction physically and legally impossible. He demanded to speak to the actual property management group, boasting that he would have the real landlord fire Mr. Nelson for this outrageous harassment. Mr. Nelson did not flinch. Instead, a faint, deeply satisfied smile touched the corners of his mouth. He looked Carter dead in the eye and dropped the ultimate world-shattering bomb. He calmly explained that the property was not owned by an anonymous corporate management group, but rather a private holding company called Cobalt Ventures, LLC. Carter's arrogant smirk instantly vanished as the blood drained entirely from his face. Mr. Nelson delivered the killing blow, stating with absolute unwavering clarity that Madeline was the sole proprietor and exclusive owner of that specific LLC. She was not his co-tenant. She was his landlord. The older man systematically dismantled Carter's entire reality, coldly informing him that his lease had been legally terminated due to criminal financial breach of contract, officially rendering him a trespassing squatter on his wife's private estate. The crushing weight of my ultimate financial checkmate slammed into Carter with the force of a freight train, stunning him into absolute suffocating silence. His mind raced frantically, trying to untangle the devastating reality that the luxurious home he had paraded around as his own profound achievement had secretly belonged to me the entire time. The brilliant, infallible corporate strategist had been completely outmaneuvered, living as a mere guest in a fortress I completely controlled. His jaw worked silently as he stared at the legal documents in his trembling hands, the undeniable proof of his total ruin staring back at him in stark black ink. Sensing the precise moment Carter's spirit broke, Mr. Nelson pulled a cell phone from his pocket and explicitly stated he was dialing the local police department to report an active trespasser refusing to vacate the premises. The threat of a second public arrest in less than 48 hours finally broke through Carter's shock. Defeated, humiliated, and stripped of every ounce of his manufactured power, he bent down and grabbed the handle of his single carry-on bag. He did not look back at the security camera or utter a single word of protest. With Mr. Nelson standing guard like a relentless sentinel, Carter slowly turned and began the agonizing walk of shame down the snow-covered street. I watched the monitor in serene silence as his solitary, pathetic figure dragged his luggage into the freezing, unforgiving darkness. The biting wind howled through the barren suburban streets as Carter trudged forward, his leather dress shoes slipping dangerously on the icy pavement. Shivering uncontrollably, he ducked beneath the flickering amber glow of a lonely streetlight to examine the thick stack of legal documents he still clutched in his freezing hand. His eyes scanned the dense legalese, bypassing the brutal reality of the restraining order to find the inventory addendum. At the very bottom of the second page, printed in stark, unfeeling font, was an address for a 24-hour self-storage facility located deep in the gritty industrial heart of the south side of Chicago. According to the notice, every single personal belonging he possessed had been legally removed from the townhouse and dumped into a rented locker. He checked his pockets, finding only a handful of crumpled dollar bills he had managed to scrounge from his carry-on bag during his humiliating layover. A luxury rideshare was no longer an option, and walking 30 miles in a blizzard was a death sentence. Swallowing a massive, jagged lump of absolute degradation, Carter dragged his suitcase toward the nearest public transit stop. He waited 40 agonizing minutes in the freezing darkness before boarding a dilapidated city bus. He sank into a cracked vinyl seat surrounded by weary night shift workers, the sharp stench of stale smoke and bleach assaulting his senses. The man who had demanded first-class service just a week prior now stared blankly out the grimy window, embarking on a miserable, jolting ride toward the absolute bottom of the socio-economic ladder. The bus hissed to a violent halt, depositing Carter onto a desolate, snow-covered sidewalk surrounded by towering chain-link fences and rusted razor wire. He approached the sprawling storage complex, a bleak concrete fortress, illuminated by harsh, buzzing fluorescent floodlights that cast long, eerie shadows across the pavement. Bypassing the unmanned front kiosk, he navigated the labyrinth of freezing, echoing corridors until he finally arrived at the corrugated metal door of unit number 402. He punched the access code provided in the eviction notice into the rusted keypad, wincing as the heavy door groaned upward on ungreased tracks. A single bare bulb flickered to life, revealing the heartbreaking reality of his current net worth. There were no garment bags or protective cases. His entire life had been aggressively purged and violently shoved into a dozen mismatched, sagging cardboard boxes. Carter ripped open the nearest flap, letting out a strangled gasp as he found his bespoke $2,000 Italian wool suits brutally crumpled and shoved together like worthless rags. He frantically tore into a second box, digging through a chaotic pile of tangled neckties and tangled charging cables. At the bottom, crushed beneath the muddy soles of his running sneakers, lay his prized collection of luxury watches. The crystal face of his favorite imported chronograph was cracked, the expensive leather bands scratched and carelessly tangled in dirty shoelaces. The pristine, curated image of wealth he had spent a decade cultivating had been reduced to a pile of discarded trash in a freezing concrete tomb. Desperation completely eclipsed whatever tiny fraction of pride Carter still retained. Standing amidst the ruins of his wardrobe in the freezing storage locker, he pulled out his phone and dialed his parents' number for the second time that evening. He just needed a warm place to sleep, a couch, a basement floor, anything to escape the biting cold of the unheated unit. The line rang 3 times before his father Richard finally picked up. Carter opened his mouth to beg for sanctuary, but Richard immediately cut him off with a visceral, booming shout that forced Carter to pull the receiver away from his ear. Richard was completely consumed by a blind, terrifying fury. He viciously informed Carter that the federal investigators dissecting the corporate espionage case had just expanded their net. Because Carter had arrogantly used his father's company as a false reference to secure his initial startup capital, the federal authorities had officially launched a massive, invasive forensic audit into Richard's own private manufacturing business. Richard screamed that Carter's reckless greed had directly endangered the family's entire financial legacy, bringing a swarm of federal agents right to their doorstep. He declared that harboring a prime suspect in an active federal investigation was equivalent to committing financial suicide. Before Carter could even stammer out a single apology or offer a pathetic excuse, Richard explicitly banished him from their property and violently ended the call. The dial tone echoed loudly in the concrete unit, sealing Carter's absolute isolation. The sharp click of the disconnected call severed Carter's final tether to the world he once dominated. He stood entirely alone in the dim, freezing confines of Unit 402, the crushing reality of his situation pressing down on his chest like a physical weight. He had absolutely $0 to his name. Every bank account was frozen, every credit card was permanently deactivated. His lucrative corporate career was obliterated, and his own family had aggressively slammed their doors in his face to protect their own skins. He was a pariah, completely stripped of the lavish lifestyle, the expensive cars, and the unearned arrogance that had defined his entire existence. The plummet from a luxury resort suite in Cabo to a grimy industrial storage locker on the south side had taken less than 48 hours, executing a flawless, catastrophic destruction of his ego. Shivering violently as the ambient temperature plummeted well below freezing, Carter looked around the bleak concrete cell for any possible source of comfort. Defeated, broken, and completely devoid of options, he dragged 3 heavy leather golf bags into the corner of the unit. He arranged them side by side, creating a pathetic, uneven mattress over the freezing cement floor. He pulled a wrinkled, cold wool overcoat from one of the cardboard boxes and wrapped it tightly around his shivering shoulders. Curled up on the lumpy canvas bag surrounded by the useless remnants of his fake wealth, Carter closed his eyes and welcomed his new reality. The harsh glare of the Monday morning sun pierced the thin gap beneath the corrugated metal door of Unit 402, dragging Carter from a restless, shivering sleep. He groaned as he peeled his stiff, aching body off the pile of leather golf bags, his muscles screaming in protest against the freezing concrete. He pulled the wrinkled wool overcoat tighter around his shoulders, his breath pluming in the frigid air as he reached down to manually haul the heavy metal door upward. The rusted track screeched in protest, revealing the bleak gray dawn of the Southside Industrial Park. Standing directly outside the threshold, perfectly silhouetted against the morning light, was a man in a nondescript beige trench coat holding a thick manila folder. Carter blinked, his exhausted mind struggling to process the presence of another human being in this desolate corridor. Before he could utter a single word of protest or demand an explanation, the stranger stepped forward with clinical precision and thrust the heavy envelope directly into Carter's chest. The man did not introduce himself or offer a polite greeting. He simply confirmed Carter's identity with a cold, practiced stare and announced that he had been officially served. The process server turned on his heel and marched briskly down the concrete aisle, leaving Carter standing alone in the freezing draft. He looked down at the official legal seal stamped across the front of the envelope, the terrifying reality setting in that his wife had initiated formal divorce proceedings before the sun had even fully risen. With trembling, frostbitten fingers, Carter ripped open the thick envelope and began sifting through the dense stack of legal documents. The paperwork was absolutely ruthless, a masterpiece of lethal litigation, crafted to systematically dismantle whatever tiny fraction of a life he had remaining. Madeline was not simply dissolving their marriage, she was executing a flawless financial execution. The primary petition demanded the immediate, unconditional return of the $90,000 IVF fund he had arrogantly drained to finance his illicit corporate venture. The legal language explicitly categorized the withdrawal as malicious marital fraud, demanding extensive punitive damages on top of the original stolen principal. Carter's eyes darted frantically across the pages, his breathing turning shallow as the severity of her legal assault became agonizingly clear. She had weaponized every single one of his arrogant mistakes against him. The final blow came in the form of a heavily highlighted addendum attached to the back of the petition. Madeline had successfully filed for and received a temporary protective order, aggressively citing his extreme financial volatility, erratic behavior, and ongoing federal criminal investigations as grounds for permanent separation. The court mandate strictly prohibited him from making any direct or indirect contact with her, her business associates, or her assets, effectively erecting an impenetrable legal fortress around her entire existence. He stared at the unforgiving legal terminology, the crushing weight of her demands anchoring his feet to the icy concrete, as he realized she intended to leave him absolutely destitute. Panic completely consumed Carter as he frantically reached into his pocket and pulled out his cracked smartphone, desperately searching for a lifeline. He bypassed his alienated family and dialed the direct number of the high-priced corporate defense attorney he had retained just weeks prior, a man known for making severe legal liabilities magically disappear. The line connected, and Carter immediately launched into a frantic, hyperventilating tirade, detailing the catastrophic eviction, the frozen bank accounts, the aggressive divorce filings, and the looming federal audit his father had screamed about the night before. He demanded immediate legal intervention, fully expecting his high-powered counsel to launch an aggressive counteroffensive against his wife. Instead of offering a fierce legal strategy, the attorney interrupted Carter with a cold, professional detachment that instantly froze the blood in his veins. The lawyer calmly explained that defending a client facing simultaneous federal espionage charges, marital fraud litigation, and total asset seizure required a massive, immediate infusion of capital. He explicitly informed Carter that unless a $25,000 retainer was wired into the firm's trust account by the end of the business day, he would formally withdraw as his legal counsel. Carter stammered, desperately pleading that all his assets were currently frozen by his wife's holding company and begging for a temporary extension. The attorney simply stated that his firm did not operate on charity, wished Carter the best of luck with his pending indictments, and abruptly severed the connection, abandoning him to the legal wolves. The dead silence of the disconnected call echoed loudly in the cold storage unit, triggering a profound, horrifying psychological shift within Carter's mind. The persistent veil of narcissistic delusion that had shielded his ego for years suddenly evaporated, exposing the brutal, undeniable truth of his absolute defeat. He sank slowly onto an overturned cardboard box, his expensive ruined suit catching on the jagged cardboard edges, as the sheer terrifying scale of Madeline's intelligence finally dawned on him. He replayed the events of the past week, tracing the invisible threads connecting his failed Mexican getaway, the poisoned digital manifest, the swift corporate termination, the biometric lock on his former home, and the devastating divorce filings. Every single disaster was a perfectly synchronized, meticulously orchestrated trap, designed and executed by the woman he had severely underestimated. Madeline had never been the oblivious, complacent wife he thought he was effortlessly deceiving. She had been quietly observing his every move, calculating his vulnerabilities, and patiently building a trap that would snap shut with lethal precision. The sickening epiphany washed over him, drowning out the ambient noise of the industrial park. He had spent months believing he was executing brilliant, masterful moves, moving pawns and knights with untouchable superiority. He finally understood the catastrophic depth of his arrogance. Carter realized with absolute certainty that he had never actually been playing chess with Madeline. She had simply bought the entire board and waited for him to checkmate himself. While Carter wallowed in the freezing misery of his concrete cell, the collateral damage of his spectacular implosion was rapidly spreading across the city. Across town in her luxury high-rise apartment, Riley was currently experiencing her own unique brand of suffocating panic. The swift, brutal termination from the firm had only been the opening salvo. That morning, she had been formally notified that federal investigators were actively looking into the stolen digital manifest and the corporate espionage conspiracy Carter had foolishly dragged her into. Pacing her hardwood floors with a half-empty glass of vodka in her trembling hand, Riley felt the walls closing in. The promises Carter had whispered in the sun-drenched suite in Cabo, promises of a hostile takeover, endless wealth and a glamorous new life, had evaporated into thin air. He was completely broke, blacklisted from the industry, and legally radioactive. She had tied her rising professional star to a man who was now sinking like a stone, and the terrifying reality was that he was going to drag her down to the bottom of the ocean with him. Self-preservation, a trait she had meticulously honed climbing the corporate ladder, violently kicked in. She had absolutely no intention of facing federal prison time or crippling financial ruin for a man who could not even afford to pay a divorce attorney. Trembling with adrenaline and fear, she realized there was only one viable escape route. She had to throw Carter directly under the bus. Rushing to her home office, Riley threw open her laptop and immediately began composing the most desperate, humiliating message of her entire life. She needed leverage, and she knew exactly what kind of ammunition would be valuable to a woman executing a flawless legal war. She addressed the email directly to Madeline, abandoning any pretense of professional courtesy or personal pride. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she outlined a transactional, desperate plea for mercy. Riley offered a highly specific, undeniable cache of digital evidence. She explicitly promised to hand over an unedited archive of private text messages, encrypted emails, and voice memos that unequivocally proved Carter had premeditated the theft of the $90,000 IVF fund weeks before their trip to Mexico. The files contained Carter's own arrogant admission that he was draining the marital assets specifically to finance the corporate theft. In exchange for delivering this massive, smoking gun on a silver platter, Riley requested a single non-negotiable concession. She pleaded for Madeline to formally drop her name from the devastating civil suit and grant her full immunity from the impending corporate liability claims. Riley framed the betrayal as a mutual business benefit, desperately hoping that Madeline's desire to absolutely crush Carter would outweigh her desire to punish the mistress. She took a ragged, shaky breath, stared at the screen for a long, agonizing moment, and slammed her finger down on the send button. I was sitting comfortably at my kitchen island, reviewing the initial structural layouts for my next venture, when the email notification chimed on my tablet. The sender's name appeared on the crisp screen, momentarily pausing my workflow. I opened Riley's message and read through her frantic, groveling proposition with a profound sense of clinical detachment. She was offering me the exact digital breadcrumbs I had already anticipated, hoping to barter her way out of the slaughterhouse by offering up Carter's head. It was a pathetic, transparent display of cowardice from a woman who had eagerly participated in my attempted destruction just days prior. She completely failed to grasp that I did not need her stolen text messages or her desperate voice notes. My legal trap was already hermetically sealed, backed by forensic accounting and an ironclad paper trail. Her email was not a valuable bargaining chip. It was simply a written confession of her own active complicity in the embezzlement and corporate theft. Without a second of hesitation, I forwarded the entire desperate plea directly to my legal team to be entered into the permanent evidentiary record. I did not feel a shred of pity for the woman who had slept with my husband and conspired to steal my intellectual property. I tapped reply, keeping my response razor sharp, and devastatingly brief. I typed, "I don't negotiate with accomplices. See you in court," and hit send, permanently sealing her fate. The notification pinged on Riley's phone almost instantly. She snatched the device from her desk, her heart hammering against her ribs with desperate hope, only to have the blood turn to ice in her veins as she read the brutal 11-word response. The phone slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the hardwood floor. The sheer, terrifying finality of my rejection shattered the last remaining illusion that she could somehow salvage her ruined life. Riley sank to her knees, burying her face in her hands as the full, suffocating weight of her choices collapsed on top of her. She had willingly thrown away a stellar corporate reputation, a six-figure salary, and her personal freedom for a manipulative, arrogant fraud who had ultimately left her entirely defenseless. She was facing catastrophic civil damages and federal charges entirely isolated, and facing the wrath of a woman she could not possibly outsmart. The conflict was over before it ever truly began, solidifying my total, inescapable dominance over the very people who had conspired to leave me with nothing. Carter was freezing in a concrete box, and Riley was drowning in the wreckage of her own treacherous ambition. They had turned on each other the moment the pressure dropped, tearing themselves apart, exactly as I had predicted. I closed my tablet, took a slow sip of my coffee, and enjoyed the absolute undisturbed silence of my flawlessly secured home. While I reveled in the pristine tranquility of my newly reclaimed life, a very different kind of storm was violently tearing through the manicured greens of the Oakbrook Country Club. The explosive news of Carter's spectacular downfall did not remain contained within the cold concrete walls of his storage unit. The salacious details of his corporate espionage, his humiliating eviction, and the impending federal audit of his father's manufacturing business swept through Richard and Brenda's elite social circles with the devastating speed of a wildfire. The country club was a vicious insular ecosystem that thrived on pristine reputations, and the toxic stench of a federal investigation was an unforgivable social sin. Richard and Brenda walked into their usual Sunday brunch, expecting their customary prime table and deferential greetings, but instead they were met with a chilling, synchronized display of total ostracization. The wealthy executives and local politicians they had spent decades meticulously courting suddenly found the ceiling fixtures incredibly fascinating as the disgraced couple passed by. Longtime golfing buddies abruptly canceled tea times, citing vague, unapologetic scheduling conflicts with zero intention of rescheduling. The wealthy wives who usually fawned over Brenda's expensive jewelry physically turned their backs, their hushed, judgmental whispers carrying clearly across the elegant dining room. The profound humiliation of being actively shunned by the very people they considered their absolute peers struck Richard like a physical blow. The manufactured illusion of their flawless aristocratic family legacy was publicly disintegrating, replaced by the ugly, unavoidable reality of their son's criminal disgrace. Desperate to salvage whatever tiny fragment of her shattered social standing remained, Brenda immediately resorted to the only defense mechanism she truly understood. She retreated to the safety of her meticulously curated online persona to play the ultimate victim card. Unable to tolerate the agonizing reality of her ruined country club status, she composed a lengthy melodramatic post on her Facebook page, carefully designed to garner sympathy and completely reframe the narrative. She attached a highly filtered, tearful photograph of herself, clutching a cup of tea, staring mournfully out a rain-streaked window. The accompanying text was a masterclass in passive-aggressive manipulation and vague, martyrdom-laced prose. She completely omitted any mention of the federal audit, the corporate theft, or Carter's eviction, instead writing an agonizingly dramatic monologue about the heavy burden of unconditional love. Brenda lamented the profound heartbreak of watching family members lose their way, claiming she was choosing grace and forgiveness in the face of unspeakable, mysterious trials. She urged her hundreds of followers to pray for those walking a dark path, intentionally framing herself as a tragic, noble matriarch, bravely enduring a storm she had zero part in creating. The notifications began pinging instantly, a steady stream of gullible friends offering hollow condolences and praising her manufactured strength. For a brief, fleeting moment, Brenda basked in the shallow digital validation, entirely convinced she had successfully manipulated the public narrative and insulated her precious reputation from the blast radius of Carter's implosion. Her digital triumph was extraordinarily short-lived. I had anticipated Brenda's inevitable attempt to publicly martyr herself, and I was entirely prepared to extinguish it the moment it materialized. The very second her manipulative post went live, I forwarded a screenshot directly to my legal team with a simple one-word directive: execute. Less than an hour later, a private courier arrived at Richard and Brenda's sprawling suburban estate, hand-delivering a stark, uncompromising cease and desist order from my lead litigator. The heavy stock paper detailed a brutal, undeniable ultimatum that instantly drained the color from Brenda's face. My lawyer explicitly warned her to immediately retract her defamatory public statements and permanently cease all commentary regarding the situation. To ensure her absolute compliance, the legal notice included a precise word-for-word transcript of a specific voicemail Brenda had left on Carter's phone 2 months prior. It was the exact recording where she aggressively encouraged her son to secretly drain my $90,000 IVF fund, viciously calling me a barren waste of money and instructing him to invest the stolen cash into his failing venture. The document coldly stated that if she did not completely scrub her social media presence within 30 minutes, the unedited audio file would be released to the federal investigators handling Richard's audit, the local press, and every single member of the Oakbrook Country Club Board of Directors. The threat of total, irrefutable exposure hung over her like a sharpened guillotine. The sheer terror of facing potential criminal liability for conspiracy to commit financial fraud completely paralyzed Brenda. The horrifying realization that I possessed irrefutable recorded proof of her active participation in the theft of my medical funds shattered her delusion of untouchable privilege. She stared at the transcript, her hands trembling violently as she comprehended the catastrophic damage that single voicemail would inflict upon her remaining social connections and her husband's already precarious legal standing. Driven by a frantic, suffocating panic, she grabbed her phone and immediately initiated a total digital blackout. She did not simply delete the manipulative post. She permanently deactivated her Facebook, wiped her Instagram, and completely eradicated every trace of her online existence. The tearful, attention-seeking matriarch vanished into absolute terrified silence. The sprawling suburban mansion that had once been the command center for their judgmental family gossip was now reduced to a fearful, isolated bunker. Richard and Brenda were entirely trapped in a prison of their own, making terrified that any misstep would trigger the release of the damning audio file. They could no longer enable Carter, they could no longer manipulate the narrative, and they could never again attempt to interfere in my life. The toxic, suffocating grip they had held over me for years was permanently broken. With a single devastating legal maneuver, I had entirely neutralized my vicious in-laws, ensuring they would spend the rest of their lives hiding in the shadows of their own disgrace. Weeks later, the battlefield shifted from suburban social warfare to a sterile, windowless conference room in downtown Chicago, high above the city streets, where the air felt thin and clinical. I sat at the long mahogany table, wearing a tailored charcoal blazer, casually sipping sparkling water. I was the picture of absolute, undisturbed tranquility. Directly across from me sat the ghost of the man I had once married. Carter looked as though he had aged a decade in a matter of weeks. The custom Italian suits he used to flaunt had been replaced by an ill-fitting, off-the-rack polyester disaster that hung loosely on his diminished frame. Sweat beaded on his forehead under the harsh fluorescent lights, his eyes darting nervously around the room like a trapped animal. He was practically vibrating with anxiety, flanked by bottom-tier legal representation, since his high-priced counsel had forcefully abandoned him. I did not offer him a polite nod or a reassuring glance. I simply watched him sweat, My posture relaxed and unbothered as the court reporter finished setting up her stenography equipment. This was the formal deposition for the civil fraud and corporate espionage suit, the precise arena where all his remaining delusions of grandeur would be systematically dismantled under oath. He tried to catch my eye, projecting a desperate silent plea for the mercy I had permanently excised from my vocabulary, but I looked right through him as if he were entirely transparent, a minor inconvenience waiting to be cleared. The heavy oak door swung open and Jamal walked in carrying a thick binder of forensic digital reports. My brilliant head of IT had been subpoenaed as the primary expert witness, and he took his seat next to my lead attorney with a look of supreme clinical satisfaction. He adjusted his glasses, completely immune to the hostile glares radiating from Carter's side of the room. After being sworn in, Jamal methodically opened his laptop and began projecting his findings onto the large monitor at the end of the table. With cold surgical precision, he walked the opposing counsel through the intricate digital labyrinth Carter thought he had so cleverly navigated. Jamal presented the irrefutable IP logs, tracing the exact origin of the unauthorized server access directly to Carter's personal devices. He displayed the precise second-by-second timestamps mapping Carter's clumsy movements through my company's internal network. Then came the killing blow. Jamal projected the access logs for the honeypot directory we had explicitly designed for this exact scenario. He walked the room through the exact moment Carter initiated the download of the poisoned digital manifest, explaining how the embedded tracking software instantly triggered the biometric locks and initiated the automated data wipe on Carter's end. The forensic evidence was a masterpiece of indisputable technical prosecution. Jamal explained the encryption protocols Carter had attempted and spectacularly failed to bypass, painting a vivid, undeniable portrait of premeditated corporate theft. Every single illicit keystroke was now illuminated in blinding high definition for the legal record. As the sheer magnitude of the digital evidence washed over the conference room, the flimsy, desperate defense Carter's bargain bin lawyer had attempted to construct instantly evaporated. There was no plausible deniability, no convenient scapegoat, and absolutely no alternative narrative left to exploit. The reality of his absolute defeat finally penetrated his thick skull, and the psychological dam holding back his panic violently ruptured. Carter physically collapsed inward, his shoulders slumping as a ragged, pathetic sob tore from his throat. He buried his face in his trembling hands, the cheap polyester of his suit pulling tight across his shaking back. His lawyer urgently whispered instructions, grabbing his arm to retain some semblance of legal decorum, but Carter ignored him completely. He lifted his tear-streaked, blotchy face, his breathing shallow and erratic, and looked directly at me. He completely abandoned his Fifth Amendment rights and began stammering out a pathetic, hyperventilating monologue. He cried about how stressed he had been, how the mounting financial pressure had clouded his judgment, and how much he regretted ever betraying my trust, pleading that he was not the monster the documents made him out to be. It was a repulsive, unfiltered display of weakness, a grown man begging for absolution in front of court reporters and hostile attorneys. He choked on his tears, explicitly stating how sorry he was for taking the money and accessing the servers, desperately hoping that a public display of remorse would magically reverse the catastrophic damage he had inflicted upon himself. I watched his humiliating meltdown without a single twitch of emotion. Not a single muscle in my face moved. My expression remained as hard and unforgiving as carved granite. I felt absolutely nothing for the sobbing, broken man across the table. When his pathetic, stammering apologies finally tapered off into wet, ragged gasps, the silence in the room was deafening. I slowly placed my water glass down on the mahogany table, the quiet clink echoing loudly against the walls. Without looking at Carter, I turned my head slightly toward my lead attorney. In a voice completely devoid of warmth, hesitation, or pity, I delivered my instruction. I loudly and clearly requested that opposing counsel's client's explicit apology for his actions be officially noted in the stenographer's transcript as a direct voluntary admission of guilt to all charges of embezzlement and corporate espionage. Carter's head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute horror as the lethal nature of my maneuver registered. His own lawyer groaned loudly, dropping his pen onto the table in total defeat. I had taken his desperate, vulnerable plea for mercy and instantly weaponized it into the final nail in his legal coffin. I held Carter's devastated gaze, my eyes devoid of any lingering humanity or shared history. It was the ultimate, undeniable display of unyielding strength, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the woman he had tried to destroy had been permanently replaced by an untouchable force of nature. The devastating effectiveness of that deposition transformed the final court hearing into a swift clinical execution. Sitting at the plaintiff's table in the polished oak courtroom weeks later, I maintained the same serene composure as the presiding judge reviewed the overwhelming mountain of evidence. When the final ruling was delivered, it echoed through the cavernous room with lethal finality. The verdict was an absolute catastrophic defeat for Carter. The judge did not simply rule in my favor, he delivered a comprehensive financial obliteration. The primary mandate explicitly ordered the immediate unconditional restitution of the entire $90,000 IVF fund that Carter had stolen. However, the true devastation lay in the addendums. Citing the overwhelming proof of premeditated deception, malicious financial abuse, and intentional infliction of distress, the court levied an exorbitant sum of punitive damages on top of the original principal. The final monetary judgment skyrocketed into a realm of debt that Carter could not possibly fathom, let alone satisfy. Sitting just 10 feet away, Carter flinched as the astronomical figures were read aloud for the permanent public record, the color completely draining from his already ashen face. His bargain rate attorney sat motionless, staring blankly at the legal pad in front of him, having offered absolutely no resistance against the tidal wave of forensic proof. The gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack, legally cementing my total victory and officially classifying Carter's actions as malicious marital fraud. Because my meticulously orchestrated corporate traps and subsequent civil filings had successfully frozen and seized whatever meager capital Carter had remaining, the court recognized his total lack of liquid assets. To circumvent his inevitable inability to pay the massive judgment up front, the judge implemented a ruthless, inescapable contingency plan. I listened with profound satisfaction as the court officially authorized maximum wage garnishment. This was not a temporary financial setback. It was a permanent, lifelong financial leash tightly secured around his neck. The legal mandate explicitly dictated that a severe, non-negotiable percentage of any future income Carter managed to generate would be immediately siphoned directly into a trust account controlled entirely by my holding company. Every single paycheck, bonus, or scrap of revenue he ever earned for the rest of his natural working life would be aggressively skimmed to satisfy the mountainous debt he now owed me. He would never again experience the luxury of financial independence or the thrill of a full deposit. The reality of his sentence washed over the courtroom, outlining a bleak, inescapable future where Carter would essentially function as my indentured financial servant. He slumped forward, burying his head in his arms against the defense table, as the judge methodically outlined the suffocating parameters of the collection order. I had not merely bankrupted him in the present, I had successfully reached into his future and confiscated every ounce of his earning potential, ensuring his betrayal would cost him quite literally forever. The financial destruction was comprehensive, but the judge was not entirely finished delivering his retribution. Before adjourning, he directed his piercing gaze down at the defense table, delivering a scathing, venomous verbal reprimand that would echo through the local legal community for decades. He systematically dismantled Carter's character, explicitly citing the breathtaking arrogance, profound moral bankruptcy, and staggering cowardice required to steal medical funds meant for his own future children. The judge did not spare Riley, who sat trembling in the gallery's back row, waiting for her own civil judgments to process. He publicly admonished them both for their reckless, deeply unethical corporate espionage, ensuring their toxic complicity was permanently etched into the unsealed public transcripts. The judge made it abundantly clear that the court viewed their actions not just as a civil dispute, but as a severe violation of basic human decency and corporate law. Because these proceedings were entirely public, this blistering judicial condemnation instantly became highly searchable public record. The detailed transcripts outlining their embezzlement, digital theft, and gross professional misconduct would automatically populate on every background check and executive screening for the rest of their lives. Carter and Riley were instantly rendered permanently radioactive in the corporate sector. No reputable firm, agency, or startup would ever risk associating with individuals carrying such a highly documented, judicially condemned history of sabotage. I had successfully burned their professional identities to the ground, salting the earth, so nothing could ever grow there again. The magistrate delivered his final resounding strike of the gavel, officially adjourning the proceedings and formally dissolving the remnants of a marriage that felt like a lifetime ago. As the courtroom slowly began to clear, the heavy atmosphere of judicial finality hung thickly in the air. I stood up smoothly, picking up my designer handbag, with a steady, perfectly manicured hand. Carter scrambled up from the defense table, stumbling frantically across the aisle before my legal team could fully intercept him. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and brimming with a pathetic, hollow desperation as he reached out his hands, trembling violently just inches from my arm. He began to beg, his voice cracking, as he pleaded for a fraction of mercy, begging me to lift the garnishments to show him a shred of the compassion he had so arrogantly discarded when he boarded that flight to Mexico. He babbled about starting over, about being a ruined man, his words bleeding together in a humiliating display of absolute submission. I stopped and turned to face him, the ambient noise of the departing gallery fading away. I methodically adjusted the collar of my pristine wool coat, smoothing an invisible crease with absolute unhurried precision. I did not offer him a smile, a scowl, or a single syllable of acknowledgement. I simply looked right through him, treating him like completely empty space, before turning on my heel and walking out the heavy double doors into the blinding, beautiful sunlight. That blinding sunlight felt entirely different exactly 1 year later, as it streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my newly appointed corner office suite. I stood perfectly still, looking out over the sprawling city skyline, sipping a freshly brewed espresso. The transition from a betrayed wife to an untouchable executive had been swift, brutal, and flawlessly executed. Following the total annihilation of Carter's corporate espionage scheme, the executive board of the boutique hotel group had called an emergency meeting. They had not just been impressed by my meticulous handling of the crisis. They were absolutely terrified by the sheer magnitude of my ruthless efficiency. I had single-handedly protected their most sensitive proprietary data, neutralizing a massive threat with surgical precision. Recognizing that my strategic brilliance was the only thing standing between them and total corporate ruin, they did not offer me a mere raise. They completely restructured the executive hierarchy and formally named me the new chief executive officer. Now my name sat in bold silver lettering on the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. The promotion brought an exorbitant salary, comprehensive stock options, and a level of untouchable authority that matched my new reality. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored silk blouse, feeling an absolute profound sense of peace radiating through my veins. I had built a magnificent empire from the ashes of a stolen life, thriving and wealthy, beyond my wildest expectations, completely untouched by the ghosts of my past. Those ghosts were currently drowning in the consequences of their own spectacular arrogance. Thanks to the uncompromising wage garnishment mandated by the civil court, Carter's existence had been reduced to a miserable, humiliating grind. Stripped of his pristine corporate facade and permanently blacklisted from any respectable firm, he was now employed at an entry-level retail job selling discounted electronics in a dying suburban strip mall. Every other Friday, he stood in a hideous polyester uniform, staring blankly at a meager paycheck that was instantly decimated. The vast majority of his hourly wages were automatically intercepted and routed directly into my holding accounts before he could even touch the money. He was essentially working to finance my luxury vacations, trapped in a bleak cycle of endless restitution. Riley had met an equally satisfying demise. The crushing weight of the impending federal litigation and the total destruction of her professional reputation had completely bankrupted her. Unable to afford her luxury high-rise apartment, and shunned by everyone in the city's corporate ecosystem, she had suffered the ultimate social humiliation. She was forced to pack her remaining belongings into a rented van and retreat across state lines, moving back into her childhood bedroom at her parents' house. The glamorous life she had viciously tried to steal had evaporated, leaving her isolated and utterly defeated in a quiet, dead-end town. Their spectacular ruin was a quiet, constant hum of justice, operating flawlessly in the background of my thriving reality. Rather than dwelling on their misery, I chose to fill my beautifully renovated townhouse with the vibrant, undeniable warmth of my true family. Later that evening, the rich aroma of a slow-roasted duck and fresh herbs drifted through my pristine kitchen as I poured a vintage Cabernet into crystal glasses. Seated around my expansive mahogany dining table were the only people who had proven their absolute loyalty when the world was collapsing. Cassidy was laughing brightly, detailing her latest wildly successful gallery, opening her fierce energy filling the room. Beside her sat Jamal, relaxed and smiling completely off the clock, and enjoying the fruits of his brilliant digital counteroffensives. There was absolutely no toxic family drama, no passive-aggressive jabs from judgmental in-laws, and zero suffocating pressure to perform for an audience of narcissists. This gathering was built entirely on a foundation of genuine love, profound mutual respect, and shared triumph. We clinked our glasses together in a loud, joyous toast, celebrating our individual victories and the unbreakable bond we had forged in the fires of absolute chaos. This was my chosen family, a tight-knit circle of brilliant, capable individuals who protected each other fiercely and celebrated each other loudly. Looking at their smiling faces illuminated by the warm candlelight, I felt a deep, resonant joy that Carter and his toxic family could never have possibly understood, let alone provided. The hollow, performative dinners of my past were permanently replaced by genuine connection. As the evening gently wound down, I stepped out onto my private balcony, letting the cool night air wash over my skin. I leaned against the wrought iron railing, reflecting on the astonishing journey that had brought me to this exact moment. It felt like a lifetime had passed since that humiliating dinner at the steakhouse, where I had sat silently while my worth was casually debated and dismissed by people who were secretly conspiring against me. I had allowed myself to be cast as the oblivious scapegoat, playing the role of the docile wife, while they attempted to drain my future. But stepping out of that illusion and demanding absolute justice had unlocked a level of empowerment I never knew I possessed. I realized that your value is never determined by the people who consistently fail to see it. Refusing to be manipulated, refusing to carry the burden of someone else's toxic insecurities is the most powerful choice a person can make. I reclaimed my narrative the moment I stopped accepting their cruelty as my normal. Now I stand at the absolute pinnacle of my life, completely unbothered by the wreckage they created. Have you ever had to draw a hard line and completely walk away from a toxic environment or manipulative people who tried to diminish your worth? Share your own stories of breaking free and choosing yourself in the comments below. The most profound lesson from this journey is the undeniable power of reclaiming your own worth in the face of deep betrayal. When toxic individuals attempt to diminish your value or exploit your trust, refusing to accept the role of a victim becomes your absolute greatest weapon. True empowerment does not stem from vindictive revenge, but rather from establishing unbreakable boundaries and meticulously constructing a life where manipulation can no longer reach you. We learn that loyalty should never excuse abuse. Share your own experiences of setting hard boundaries and walking away from toxic relationships in the comments below.